Today I continue with the book of Isaiah, and I've noticed some interesting things, and I keep bringing up the idea of the YouTube idea. When you look at Isaiah and you go 66 chapters and it's cradle to grave through the whole thing, but wait, unlike some of the narratives, which you go back and get a running start, like a TV show that says last week on, so you got to get a running start. And sometimes with the historical narratives, we do that. But very often the prophets were are from like I'm going to say YouTube to YouTube. Like I said, chapter 1 it's by itself. Chapter 2 through 5 it's by itself. Chapter 6 it's by itself. 7 through 12, and then we're looking at then we looked at 13 and 14. Today I'm looking at 15 and 16 together, and 17 and 18, because 17 and 18 is two different YouTubes. 15 and 16 is one YouTube, 17 and 18 is another. 15 and 16 is about Moab, 17 and 18 about Damascus. But before I go on with this, the interesting idea I wanted to put forward is I didn't think about this when I was doing the minor prophets. I got to thinking that, how long would it take to read one page of the Bible and pretend that that was its own YouTube? So it give you an idea of time. So if these minor prophets were broken up into ideas, like Jonah would have been one story, some of the smaller ones one idea, like Nahum and Obadiah. I was looking at Zechariah, who was one of the longer minor prophets, but I realized it was broken up into 3 or 4 subgroups. It was a vision that went from like 1 through 3, and then 4 through 6, and then 7 through 9. You get the idea. So it's actually 4 different YouTubes on his channel. So I read one column of my Bible slowly, and it took about 4 minutes to carefully just read it in a natural tone. So that tells me it would take about 10 minutes to do one page. So if you look at something that's 2 pages long, idea to idea, that would be the same as a 20-minute video. So if you look at that with the prophets, then you get an idea of how to break this up into ideas. I don't have to go back to Isaiah 1 all the time to say to be continued or previously in Isaiah, because I don't need to. It's an encapsulated idea. Now, when you're looking at the stories, for example, if I was doing Genesis this way, you would do Genesis 1 through 3, and then you do the Cain and Abel story, maybe references last time on. Then you might reference Cain, Abel. Now we're going to talk about the pre-flood stuff, with the sons of God, daughters of men. Then you get to the flood, you kind of hit on Genesis, and as you're going, you don't have to go back as far. Okay, and then we get to Abraham, and you go back. Well, remember Abraham came from Terah, that came from this. Then once you solidify Abraham, you're looking at Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, and you go back to Abraham. Then you go back to Isaac. You see what you're doing, just like you would in an episodic television show. And that would be a good way to read the history. As the history gets more complex, dealing with like David, well, remember when David did this. Now, last time David did this, and then here comes Solomon, and we work our way through the kings. And that's kind of how you have to do it. That's the way when I was approaching this. But if you think of the bigger books as an episodic television show, and then you saw the prophets as YouTubes, it's just a way for our 21st century mind to process this information. So today, instead of me going back to what God said in previous YouTubes, I'm going to move on with, here we are in 13. And, I'm sorry, here we are with 15, because we did 13 yesterday. 13 and 14 were about Babylon, just to touch on that one. And not going to go into it so much, but it talks about how he will hold Babylon. He will punish the world for their evil. Babylon is a type of the world that's evil. But 14 is, I will have mercy upon Jacob. So, 13, I'm doing a small recap, said I would. 13 is an idea of, this is something Babylon's going to have to bear because of the people they've chosen to be. That he's going to lift up a banner. And so he will punish the world for their evil and the wicked for their iniquity. The fact that they were raised up to be this sword or this wrath upon Israel did not mean that they weren't arrogant and spite and mean and that had idolatry and adultery and hypersexuality and all these other things thrown in there, he talks about how he will stir up the Medes against them and he will destroy them. So he brought them up to be this sword, and he took them down. And so he even talked about that. Who will the saw say to the hand that had it? Will the axe talk, and say, "Look what I've done"? The pride going on, but he chooses to have mercy on Jacob and will yet choose Israel, and he will have them. They will rule over their oppressors. See, this is justice. You oppressed me. Now I'm going to be in control over you. And he talks about this. He even gives the allegory, not really an allegory yet, the typology of how the fall of Babylon, and by inference the mystery Babylon, is like the fall of Satan. How you lifted yourself up. You said, "I'm going to be great. Look what I've done. I will be like the Most High." See, that's what. We get an idea that that's exactly what Nebuchadnezzar does. Haven't got to it yet in the book of Daniel. He lifts himself up, and God brings him down for a while, then brings him back up. But he talks about how Babylon is like Lucifer, and we're seeing an idea of this is how Lucifer fell. He lifted himself up. He brought about and created this secession against God and was put down. Well, that's what Babylon is doing. So we get to see what happened in heaven, but it's also typified in what happened on earth. So he talks about that. And so he talks about how Palestinia, that he will, as they try to rise up and bring their power up, he will keep them down, that they will be dissolved, and none shall be alone in the appointed times. The people that have founded Zion and the poor of the people shall trust in the nations. That's what this is about, to get the nations to trust in God, to set his ensign up in Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, men will come, like we've seen in other prophets and prophecies to come, that people will grab a hold of the Jews and say, "Take me to your God. Let's go to your God." We see that here. The burden of Moab. Once again, a prophecy against Moab. And it was interesting when I looked at this prophecy, is that he knows the area, the topography, the geography of Moab almost as well as he does Israel. And it's interesting. These nations aren't above his scope. He knows them. He knows the names of their cities. He knows the names of their rivers. He knows their area. He knows those people. He has loved those people. He still loves Palestine, the Palestinians, the Philistines. He loved the Syrians. He wanted them to come to him by setting up this beachhead in Jerusalem where the name of the Lord would be and all people could come to him. But like Jesus noticed, but you would not. And that is the sin that needs to be rooted out. But you would not. He knows Edom. He knows Moab. He knows Ammon. He knows the areas. The burden of Moab. This is what you have to go through, Moab. Because in the night Ar of Moab is laid waste and brought to silence. Because of the night Kir of Moab is laid waste and brought to silence. At night they're brought to silence. Something happens that they get taken away in the night. But there's a lot of place names here that are foreign to us. He has gone up to Bethjath, to Dibon, to the high places to weep. Moab shall howl over Nebo. Again, I don't know where those geographies are. I could have done some research. But the point is, God knows. We act like God doesn't know where we live or our topography here in the United States, where you live in the United States. He doesn't know the cities and the towns and the hills and the streams and the lakes and the rivers. But he does. He knows them. But in their streets they shall gird themselves with sackcloth on the top of their houses, and everyone shall howl weeping abundantly. Moab, remember, these were the lion-faced people, were very prideful, and God's going to bring them down. He's going to bring them down at the same time that he's rushing the Assyrians in to bring down the northern kingdom, and they do like a flood into and around Jerusalem, but dissipate back. They never take Jerusalem. But the point is they get into these other nations like a flood, and they're going to be. And Hezbon will cry, "My heart shall cry out for Moab. His refugees shall flee unto Zoar. A heifer of 3 years old For by the mounting of Lulath and the weeping shall go up. In the way of Horam they shall rise up as a cry of destruction. Again, he knows the topography. He knows what's going on, and he does have a heart for these people. I was thinking today, we always talk about the will of God, the will of God, the will of God. There is a sense of the will of God in what he wants to do, but there's also a will of God in the sense of what he has to do. Those are two different wills. We all know parents or leaders or authorities who have what they want to do, what they want to do in a situation, how they want to give mercy, but justice forces me to go the other way, even though I don't want to. If you've broken the law heinously and you're sorry for it, but there has been no payment for your sin, for your penalty, I have no choice but to send you to jail or to send you down the road, send you off to prison, whatever. And he doesn't do that out of a sense of glee. But the law must be kept. God's holiness must be met. He cannot be sinned against. He does have a heart for these. That's why we see the word plead. I will plead with you. Don't make me come down there and do this. And we kind of did. It just up yours the continual way. I will not. Being hard-hearted. Like I saw in Isaiah earlier. That when he sends them, who will go for me? He's telling you, you're going to go, but they're going to choose not to hear, and they're going to choose not to see. They're going to choose not to understand. This was about them knowing that this is about God's judgment. He's giving disclosure. He's telling them what's going to happen, even though he knows they're hard-hearted and they don't want to hear. But he has to judge them. It's part of his court. It's a part of how he does with justice. He doesn't just take you up there and you go, well, I didn't know. By sending a prophet that you won't listen to proves your hard-heartedness. So we tend to think that a lot of these scriptures are written to very hard-hearted people. That's why I struggle with sometimes we Christians taking some of these out of context and slapping them against the wall or on a bumper sticker. But he goes on and talks about Zoar. He talks about the borders there. And so, send ye a lamb to the ruler of the land, from Selah to the wilderness unto Zion, to the daughters of Zion. Go and try to find a way of appeasement of this God. It shall be that as a wandering bird is cast out, so the daughters of Moab shall be in the fords of Aram. The fords of Aram does not sound like a pleasant place. Fords were usually that desolate place, a place where you have, those big giant cracks in the ground where people can get into and stuff like that. They're not good places. He tells them to take counsel, execute judgment. Make thy shadow as the night in the midst of the noonday. Hide the outcast. Bewray not them that wandereth. Let mine outcast dwell in thee, Moab. Be thou a convert to them, for the face of the spoiler, for the extortionist is that they come to an end, and the spoiler ceased. The biggest sin that Moab had was it did not take in the refugees that came from the Assyrians. The Assyrians set up a refugee, were coming in, and Moab would not accept the refugees. This was their sin, that they did not, and this was the sin of the nations around them. See, God did. Instead, they turned around and started to spoil, and that's not how God wanted it. Yes, this was his wrath. He had brought up Assyria. Assyria was coming in, but he wanted those nations to have compassion on their brother Israel and say, you're getting what you deserve, for the wrath of God has come, but we will take in your refugees to help. Just the opposite happened. They started praying. All these nations started praying on Israel, and God holds them accountable to that. So therefore they would be taken down because they're prideful. Therefore shall Moab howl for Moab, everyone that shall howl for the fountains of Kedar. For the fields of Heshbon languished, and the vines of Shema, the lords of the heathen, have broken up the principal plants thereof. He talks about how it's going to be taken down, how Moab is going to be taken down. Therefore my bowels shall sound like a harp for Moab, and mine inward parts for Haresh. And it shall come to pass that when it is seen in Moab, is weary on the high place, that he shall come to his sanctuary to pray, but he shall not prevail. That even when Moab goes to maybe seek their own God, but not seek God, they will not prevail. Your sin must be paid for. This is the word of the Lord has spoken concerning Moab. But now the Lord has spoken, saying, within 3 years, as the year of the hireling, the glory of Moab shall be contemned, and all the great multitude and the remnant shall be small and feeble. I'm not going to get to Damascus today, but what I'm going to say is in this one is that we take away that God knows the nations. He judges the nations around them. He knows their topography. He knows what they've done wrong. He catches them on that. They're too prideful to accept the refugees, to understand that this sinful nation that sinned against their God, we should take in the refugees. We're not a part, we're not a part of that spanking. We're not a part of that chastisement. But it was just the opposite happened. And God held them accountable. Many of these nations, you'll see, God is holding them accountable for how they treated Israel at this time of destruction, at this time of unease, at this time of wrath. And, God expected them to maybe accept and back up and let God do what God's going to do because of the sinfulness. And it's almost like saying they didn't have a dog in the fight. You let Jehovah take care of Israel and you stay out, and you maybe help with the hurting ones. But this has to happen because they're sinning against their God. The Moabites could have said, even in their paganism, your God is going after you because you sinned against him. Well, that's between you and him. Even though the God of the universe is the God of all of these nations. But what nation is turned against their God? That's a point that one of the other prophets has made. What nation ever turned against their own God? None of these nations actually ever rebelled against their gods. It's interesting. Israel was the only nation to rebel against its gods. The others accepted their gods. They went with their gods. Whatever they said went. But this nation rebelled against their gods, and the pagan nations could have said, hey, you rebelled against your God, this is what you get. Now, he wanted to be the gods of all these nations. I'm doing a lot of commentary here because I don't think we think about this correctly. I don't think we think about this in that type of format. But if we do, it'll make Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel make more sense when we understand the character of God and the relationship between Israel and God and why this has to happen because they have sinned against their gods. And the other nations should see this and respond accordingly, but they are not. They are preying also like a bunch of hyenas on Israel. And God's like, no, that's not what I wanted. So anyway, we're looking at this. God's going to look at other nations, and he's going to give other nations burdens. But I think also looking at Moab gives us a running start and understanding of how these other nations will be treated by God. God is a just God. How he treats one, he's going to treat the other. And that's what we're seeing here in Isaiah. Thank you.